Buenos dias. Thank you for coming. I want to talk with you about an idea that I'm working on. And what I'm going to be doing is trying to suggest a way to bring two very different political ideals together to create a third, new, higher moral ideal. Maybe it's impossible, but I'm going to show you what I'm trying to do, and then we can talk together and see what you think about it. I do political philosophy, and what political philosophers do, as I think of it, we describe constellations. We describe stars up in the sky, which are like ideal societies, the way a society might function if it functioned in an extremely effective, wonderful way to create the opportunities for good lives for everyone. We describe these constellations, these moral ideas of justice, with the hope that some people, when some societies, like the ship of state, when the politicians and the citizens come to affirm one of the ideals that we describe, they'll steer their ship by that star towards justice. So when a society is trying to decide through its elections, through its politicians, what kind of a society should it become? Which direction should the society go? What should it aspire to? What should it move toward as a society through time? We philosophers try to put up stars in the sky that can help people steer. That's our ambition, at least. It's kind of a strange ambition to have, but that's what I do. And the state of what I want to describe to you will probably be familiar. It's what I think of as the moral status quo. That is, it's not the way things are in the world, but it's the way things are in the world of philosophers. And in the world of philosophers, there are two rival moral ideals, two different constellations in different parts of the sky. And each of those constellations has a long line of defenders, philosophical defenders, who say, go to that star. And the other people say, go to that star. And there's people who steer the ship of state, often go one way, and then they go the other way. And you may see when I'm thinking about Chile, but in a moment. So one of the ideals, a very familiar one perhaps to you, is an ideal associated with the idea of social justice. That when a society, when a political party gets their hands on the wheel of the state, they should turn the ship to the left and move the ship towards what they understand to be social justice. And one philosopher, an American philosopher who is very prominent in this regard, is John Rawls. And John Rawls wrote a book called A Theory of Justice in 1971, which is probably the most sophisticated account of what social justice is from a philosophical perspective. But John Rawls is just one in a long line of thinkers in this direction. I put up Rousseau, who Rawls relies upon a lot. Karl Marx, I suppose, is in this area too. They don't all agree on the details, of course, right? But these people on this side, they say, if you want to make your society better or make your society more just, you people, and you citizens, you politicians, you people in the societies, you should go left. And the basic idea of social justice is that community comes first. And from that idea that community comes first, people like Rawls say, well, all the social wealth, all the wealth we see in a society is social wealth. It's owned by everyone together. And so the central role of the state, what the government should do, is take possession of that wealth or control and moderate the distribution of that wealth so that it's spread across the society in a way that is just or fair. And in that role, in that idea on the left side, economic liberties, private property, stands in the way of that ambition to make the society more just. Because if people have strong property rights and strong freedoms to decide for themselves how they want to work, how they want to save, how they want to spend, if individuals have those economic liberties, that stands in the way of the state moving the things around to achieve justice. So on this side, John Rawls' side, the social justice side, they say, economic liberty, not so much. Social justice, yeah, a lot. On the other side are philosophers who see the world very differently. And I put Friedrich Hayek there. I put John Locke up in the heavens. I mean, I could add other people like Adam Smith would be over here. Milton Friedman would be over here. And these people say when they have a chance to have their followers or people who believe in these philosophies get their hands on the wheel of the ship of state, they say something like, go right, turn right. And their idea is that society are individuals. If you think about a society as a group, you must understand the essential moral fact that what a society really is a collection of people just like you and me, individual people with their lives to lead. They think it's so important for us to think about the fact that a society really is just a collection of individual people, each of whose lives is incredibly important. And if you lose sight of that fact and think too much about the collective, we may break a few eggs to make some omelets, but those eggs are what really mattered. That is the individual lives that mattered. And because they think that individuals are the most important thing, and maybe the only thing that makes a society up, they say that people, for example, own themselves. Owning themselves, they own their labor. Owning their labor, they can mix their labor with things in the world. They have the right, maybe a natural right, to own property, to come to own things in the world, to decide for themselves how they want to use the things that they own, how they want to work, what jobs they want to, what occupations they want to pursue, what wages they're willing to accept for their work. They personally decide that. So they think that on this side, that economic liberty is really important. And the role of the state, the primary role of the government on this view, is to protect the rights of individuals, and especially and including their property rights, their economic liberties. That's what the state should do. So on this side, we get economic liberty, yes, and social justice, not so much, or often not at all. So that's kind of the way the philosophers divide the world. And you can see, I don't know, you can see that you can put political parties, politicians, and identify politicians and the way and their policies in light of these star maps that the philosophers work out. So I put Michelle Bachelet over here. I don't know, a stronger version, I suppose, if we did this, might go, we might say Allende, perhaps a stronger of the ideal of social justice, an egalitarian ideal of social justice. I put Piñera over here. I don't know, we could probably do Sergio de Castro. I don't know, one of the Chicago boys. I don't know if that's correct, but something like that over here in Chile. And what I see, this is the bit that I'm, as a non-Chilean, but a person very interested in your country, what I see in Chile is a country where people have put their hands on the wheel of state, and at one point they go, oh good, let's steer this way. So they go that way. Then the next group comes in and gets their hands on the wheel of state, and to some degree they go, oh cool, I'm going to go this way. And the next person gets back and they go, and you know, so it's sort of this and that. And the important thing about that, I suppose, is that there seems to be no compromise between these two paradigms. They start with a different idea of society. One thinks that we're a community, essentially. One thinks that we're individuals with rights, essentially. And so it seems that one side has to win. And it seems that we have to make choices. Every society has to make choices. Economic liberty or social justice. Democracy or capitalism. Free markets or fairness. Every society at some point has to make a choice. And I'm interested in the idea, can you move? Thanks. I'm interested in the idea that there might be a better way. There might be a constellation, a moral constellation that is higher and more attractive than either of the two I just described. And it's a constellation that, as I think of it, combines the important moral insight, the most important moral insight in each of the two existing paradigms, but it also rejects and leaves behind what I see as really serious defects in each of the existing paradigms. So, I know you can probably see my cheesy attempt to, I chose constellations that I gather are visible from the southern hemisphere. I don't know these constellations, but I gather you people do. So I combine them in an attempt to connect up here. And I call the constellation market democracy. And the idea of market democracy, the basic idea is that economic liberty, yes. Social justice, yes. Is there a way to combine the importance of economic liberty with the importance of social justice and create not just a compromise between political parties, sort of a mushy in-between, a little bit of both but not really much of either, but rather a kind of knockout blow. And it's a knockout blow in the moral, philosophical sense because it's an attempt to create an ideal that stands as an ideal as a rival to the other ideals. It's not that we come down from the stars and in the clouds compromise, and that's market democracy. My idea is that market democracy is meant to be, at least, I hope, a moral ideal in itself, between and above the other two, that can be defended on technical philosophical grounds against all comers. So that's the idea. So my idea for doing this, I'll talk about each of these concepts a little bit. I'll just say a little bit about each. The Chicago boys and Hayek and Milton Friedman, when they talk about economic liberty, they tend to emphasize the instrumental value of economic liberty. They were economists, and so it was natural for them to understand and to wish to emphasize the economic efficiency-directed benefits of markets and economic freedom. So they would talk about the way markets use information, make use of local knowledge, for example. They would talk about the way markets could distribute goods in efficient manners and put productive resources into the right places at the right times. All really important concepts, important parts of the defense of markets. But what they didn't talk about, I think what they should have talked about, is they didn't talk about the intrinsic value of markets, the intrinsic value to individual people of economic liberty. So I'll say something about that, but let me take one step back. I mentioned a minute ago that the social justice people see community as the first thing, and the free market people see individuals and their individual lives as the most important thing. Market democracy starts with a different idea. It says that a society is essentially a community of individuals. So we are individuals, each with a life to lead, a life that's incredibly important to each of us. But each of us has the ability, so we just think about that for a minute, because it's actually really important to get your head on that, morally speaking. So the first step, there's two steps. The first step is the claim that each of us, when we look at our own lives and think about what our life means to us, which we do too seldom, by the way, but if we just pause for a second and do it, we can see, I think, each of us, that our life is incredibly important. It's so important to you, each of you, I hope, that your life goes well because it's the only life you have. So your life is precious to you, and it should be. You should treat it that way. But once you do that, once you're able to see and pause to reflect on how important your life is, my suggestion is that you can also then look around you at all the people in this room and all the people in society, people who are not privileged enough to be in a room like this but are part of your society, and every one of their lives is incredibly important too. That we can recognize, by recognizing the importance of our own life and really thinking about that, we have the capacity, I think, to then extend that vision to see the importance of every life in the world, but in our society, let's say. So that's what I mean by community. We're individuals, but we're a community. That is, people who can see each other's lives and the importance of everyone's life. But we're also, because individuals matter, that's why the community matters. But the community matters. Again, community is not first. It's a community of individuals that matters. So anyway, back to that economic liberty stuff. The people on the right, the familiar Hayekians and so on, emphasize the instrumental importance of liberty. But I think it's important to emphasize what I think of as the intrinsic or the moral importance of liberty. Because liberty, economic liberties especially, when we exercise economic liberties, we define ourselves. And it's an important domain of us deciding who each of us is as an individual involves the way we exercise our economic liberties. And I'll give you an example. I'm not sure how many of you are undergrads. Like what years are you? Juniors, seniors, all over? I don't know. Well, I'll just give my example anyway. You can track it or not. Something I've noticed for years, is that when I teach, I now teach at Brown, but before I taught at Stanford, and before that at Princeton. And when I teach undergraduates, I noticed that freshmen and sophomores are very happy. They just got there. They're trying this. They're trying a little of that. They're kind of thinking they're going to choose a major. They're making friends. Maybe they study. I don't know. But the main thing is, they're in la la land, right? They're on some beautiful campus. And then their freshman year, and then they're even happier in their sophomore year, and they're really, really happy by their junior year. But when they come, those same happy kids, those little happy creatures, come into my office, their senior year, I notice a change coming over them. There's a certain tension in the sides of their jaw. There's an anxiety creeping into the corners of their eyes. Because they say things to me like, not just like telling me happy stories about what class they think they might take next semester, but they say things like, can you write me a letter because I'm applying for a job at an investment bank? And I say to the kid, but I thought you were going to be a social worker. And he says, well, I thought that too, but thinking more about it, I really want to be an investment banker and make some money because I didn't grow up with much money and I want to have a lot of money. Or the kid comes in and says, I'm going to be a social worker. And I said, oh, I thought you were from some high finance family in New York and your father was paying for your tuition only because he knew you were going to take over the family hedge fund. And he says, yeah, I know my dad really wants me to be a hedge fund manager like him, but I just can't do it. I really want to be a social worker. Or they become art history majors, and now they're starting to wonder, what's going to happen with me as an art history major? Well, how am I going to make a living for myself? Or I want to start a startup, but I can't decide how to do it. And they have this stress now. I'm joking about it, but it's actually kind of serious stress in their lives because they're now transitioning from being adolescents, late adolescents, into becoming the adults they're going to be. They're actually now, for the first time in their lives, setting themselves on the course of life that they are going to lead. What's the mechanism? What's the precise mechanism by which they're doing that? It's the mechanism of choosing a career. It's an exercise of an economic liberty. And I think that at that moment, people become adults. They pass from the stage of adolescence, late adolescence, when they start becoming partly through becoming economically responsible individuals. And I think that's for me, it's sort of an easy way to talk about the importance of economic liberty. I actually, a slightly more technical way, I first started thinking about economic liberties and its importance by reading feminist literature, and especially feminist literature from the 19th century, the 1900s. 19th century, punch drunk. In the late 1800s, late 1800s, a lot of the most powerful feminist writers said things like this. They said things like, no matter how, even if a woman is being provided all the gilded material means in the world, even if through the patriarchal system she's being provided with a gilded cage with a nice little swing and a little cup for bird feed that gets poured in every morning by the patriarchal husband or patriarchal society, no matter how, given all the gilded material means in the world, if women were still denied the chance to be causes of that state of affairs, if they were denied their economic liberties, if they were denied the rights to own property, the rights to have careers, the rights to perhaps be causes of the lives they're living themselves, then they're being disrespected no matter how much material stuff they were given. So women knew vividly that being given stuff by somebody else, some other agency, whether it's the patriarchal system, as they called it, or whether it's the state, perhaps, that's not necessarily respectful of people. The process matters too. And I think that feminist insight is generalizable, perhaps as a critique of European welfare states and American welfare states, maybe Chilean ones too. There's something about the importance of people being causes of their own lives. And so I think there's an argument for economic liberty that emphasizes the intrinsic value of economic liberty. Second, and much more briefly, I plan to do this in 10 minutes. I didn't mean to make it into a lecture. But social justice, I'll just say something about very briefly. So social justice, again, I think there was a mistake made by the people on the left about social justice, many of them. And I want to explain what I think is a better way to think about social justice, a more respectful way to think about social justice. And as you'll see, this way of thinking about social justice that's more respectful connects with this more serious way of thinking about economic liberty. About social justice. What is social justice? Well, you can think about it two ways. Very simply. You might think that social justice means equality, and that the society is more socially just or more socially unjust, depending on whether the distribution of goods in that society is more equal or less equal. Pretty familiar idea, right? So if you have a society where the distribution is like this, and you want to make it more just on this theory, the equality theory, you make the society more just by making it more equal. Pretty familiar, right? But there's a problem that's pretty obvious, I'm sure, to many of you. What if you have a society like this, and now you're going to make it more equal? And remember, if justice is equality, then when you equalize, you get more justice, by definition, without any escape. But now imagine we equalize it, but as we're equalizing it, people are getting poorer. And I can just limbo on down. A really, really equal society where people are really, really poor. Notice that, well, you couldn't see it, but it was true that way down there, it was really, really equal. So if justice is equality, that society of deep poverty, of deep and universal poverty, was just. It was more just than a society of inequality where everyone was richer. So that's a very simple way to explain a worry about one way of thinking about social justice. There's a different way. It's widely associated with John Rawls, who's on the left, but many other people sort of play with this, and I play with a version of it too. And the way they do it is something like this. Imagine a society that has a distribution roughly like this, and now imagine a different society that has a distribution like this. And so this society is more unequal. And by the egalitarian theory, this society is more just, right? But Rawls says, well, he wouldn't say these words, but I'll paraphrase Rawls by saying these words. If you want to know what justice is, watch my thumbs. So Rawls says, if you want to compare two sets of social institutions in terms of whether they're just or unjust, or more just or less just, we should ask, over time, what kind of distribution does it tend to generate? And what we should focus our attention upon is giving priority to the poorest people in the society. So we know whether a society is just or unjust on this prioritarian approach to justice by not thinking about relational things like who's got what and how does that relate to other people's stuff, but rather focusing our attention on the poorest members of society. And we ask, how well are the poorest members of the society doing? So you can allow, if you think, again, thinking my thumbs, this society, the poorest class, has substantially more control of material means than the poorest in this society. That means on this prioritarian account that this society is fair. This is the society, not this one, that best reflects our commitment to every life mattering, to being sure that every citizen has not only rights and formal liberties, but also has the material means, the real opportunities to make something of their lives. So their lives don't become stunted, but they can say, your life is stunted, but hey, we're all stunted together. But rather, your life can become enriched. You can become the person you might be. You can develop yourself into the amazing creature every human being has the potential to be. So what I work out is an account of economic liberty which emphasizes the intrinsic value, and I combine it with a theory of social justice, a deep commitment to social justice on a prioritarian level. And we do the next slide, then I'll stop. And that's how. And so I wrote a long book, sort of, that starts off in like in very easy, gentle terms, and then gets more and more technical as it goes. And by the end, the last couple of chapters are pretty technical. But leaving all that technical stuff aside, what I want to try to do is show how that idea of economic liberty, where we think to ourselves, when someone proposes to pursue social justice, we now should ask, on my account, does this proposal for social justice respect the individual freedom, the economic liberty of every citizen? Does the proposal require that everyone do things the same way? Does it lower the horizons of people's ambitions to experiment and live their lives in their own way and make their own choices in the economic realm? If it does, that approach to social justice violates economic liberty. And it disrespects our fellow citizens by forcing them to live in a certain way rather than empowering them to live in the various diverse ways they might choose to live on their own, exercising their own economic liberties in their own ways. And then with social justice, I say, does the conception of social justice have this, I think, benighted conception of social justice as equality? Or is social justice directed at truly respecting, most of all, being concerned with the poorest class of society and focusing like a laser on the conditions of the lowest working class in society and asking consistently, is there a way to tweak the system so that through time, that class can get more? And I think that property rights are not absolutes. I reject that sort of strict libertarian line. I think there's an important role for the state to be played in providing these opportunities for people. I think there is a redistributive role for the state, but it has to be done very carefully because it cannot be done in such a clumsy, ham-handed way or an authoritarian top-down way that it violates people's economic liberties. We're trying to free people, not to control them. Social justice becomes an engine of control. It's not social justice. It's a perversion of social justice. Social justice, as I understand it, is about helping everyone, and especially the most poor, live lives of meaning. But there's no country that I know of that has the ingredients that Chile has to think in this way, or at least to work out, perhaps, through your own much deeper experience about your society, how this kind of a system could be, this constellation might be built together for you. And I just wonder whether, I don't know, I'm going to close with this kind of as a question, it would take will on the part of citizens of Chile and people like you, future opinion leaders, people with privileges and responsibilities because of those privileges, to be willing to move the conception of social justice toward the idea of economic liberty and to move the conception of economic liberty towards the conception of social justice in such a way that both those ideas could fit together, that they could interlock and be a new way of thinking about social justice, a new way of thinking about what it means to be a community of individuals who are sincerely committed to respecting each other's freedom and the importance of every life. So I don't know whether this ideal appeals to you, and I don't know whether Chile has the will or could have the will to be willing to reach to the other side. There's a virtue I hear, convivencia. I'm not sure if it's actually a Chilean virtue. I heard before I came to Chile it was being coexistence, or maybe more than coexistence. Hearing the other side, if it exists in Chile, this might be kind of a test case. And I'll end with that.
Thank you.
I talked for a long time.
So, how much time? ¿Cuánto tiempo tenemos todavía? ¿Media hora? So we have half an hour for Q&A.
Great.
And I will take the liberty to begin with a question, a very brief one, and then I'll open the floor to you so anyone can make questions.
Are you going to ask in Spanish?
I'm going to ask you in English, but
if you say
feel
buenos,
free.
if you limit yourself to buenos dias, I don't need to.
Sure. No, but siéntanse libre, obviamente, de preguntar en inglés o español. Acá le hacemos traducción, o hay traducción, de hecho. So, very briefly, John, if you would have to sit and design public policy and economic policies and proper size of government and all that, based on your star,
Yes. Yeah.
how would that be different from what, for instance, Hayek would do? I mean, to what degree would you and Hayek, not on a theoretical level,
Yes.
but on a practical level, disagree on, the role of government, the scope of intervention, and all that?
Yes.
Because it seems to me that you have a lot more similarities with Hayek than with John Rawls, for instance. Maybe I'm wrong, but on a practical level, basically.
Yeah. So a lot of what I'm doing in the book is bringing together John Rawls and Friedrich Hayek. That's kind of those are my big protagonists that I want to try to make friends out of them. And philosophically, they're not friends at all. Hayek does not take seriously, in my opinion, does not take seriously enough the moral importance of the moral importance of liberty generally, but especially the moral importance of economic liberty. And on a theoretical level still, Hayek, he wrote a book, for better or worse. So Rawls has a book called A Theory of Justice, and Hayek has a book called The Mirage of Social Justice. It's volume 2 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. So Hayek rejects social justice completely, or so he says. So they have very little in common theoretically. But it also is true, as I think you're pointing out, that Hayek was unusual among the free market fundamentalists from not being very much of a fundamentalist at all. Hayek thought that there was a role for government. Hayek was a classical liberal, not a libertarian, not a conservative also, as he famously argued. But Hayek thought there was an important role for the state in providing a social safety net, a floor beneath which no one need descend. And I think that's right generally. More specifically, though, I think that a just society the state would tax people and would always try to design social services in ways that protected people's economic liberty to the greatest extent possible. So I'm very interested in the idea of a universal basic income, of people being given cash grants on a monthly basis to use as they choose. There's a proposal in the US that a lot of people are talking about, but politically very difficult, of abolishing the welfare state and replacing it with the cash transfers. There's a city in California, Stockton, California, that's experimenting with this now. The mayor of that city is under incredible political pressure and being bashed, mainly from the right, but basically from everybody, because he now has a program of giving $500 a month to the poorest segment of society in the city. And they get the $500 a month regardless of what they do. They just get it, it shows up in their automatically in a checking account that they have to open, and then they can just use the money any way they want. And they get the cash infusion every single month, no matter what they do. They just get that cash. So if they take it and they buy wine and just, or bums with it, just drink with it, they still get the next check the next month. If they take it and decide they want to go to school, fine, they do that way. And I like that program. I like that way of doing that way of providing social justice, of providing material goods to people. I think it respects people. That means they might make bad choices, and humans make bad choices all the time. But it seems to me to be a vastly preferable way to respect our fellow citizens, especially the most poor citizens, than the kind of system that we have in the US now, where there's social workers who do a lot of surveillance of people's lives. They want to check to see whether they have a live-in husband now or a live-in partner. They want to count how many children they have. They surveil them to see whether they have a part-time job, and they cut down their benefits if they do. All that kind of intrusive surveillance that I think is a fundamentally undignified experience of the poor in a welfare state like the US. That could be wiped away if we went for a more dramatic market-based program of social welfare, like giving people cash. So too, and this is an area that you all know far more about than I do, but one of the famous proposals from Milton Friedman regarding education, of course, was vouchers that, like giving cash to people, instead of giving them welfare checks and checks for their housing and checks for their food, just giving them money to use what they like. Milton Friedman suggested, and some others suggested, that people should be given vouchers for their education to go use as they wish. I know that the voucher system has a complicated history in Chile, but that kind of an idea, adjusted in such a way that there was genuine competition, I think seems to be an important element of it. That kind of a thing I would advocate. So the idea is, this is kind of a perverse, when I say it this way, people on the left start to dislike the view, but what I see is the left has this idea of politicizing society and making our relationships increasingly political because we're always thinking about our status and our relationship to each other. My idea is that a more free society and a more equitable society, and a society that really is a community of individuals, is a more commodified society. It's a society where people are given the power individually through their personal control of wealth to make decisions on their own basis. The wealth comes from the society and is given to them by the state, but then they are the nodes, they're the unit that gets to make the choices about how they spend the money, rather than some authoritarian saying it from the top down for all.
We agree on that.
I'm glad.
¿Alguna pregunta? Please.
You mentioned some political parties near the left stars and near the right stars.
Yes.
What kind of political parties might be near the market democracy?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there are elements of mainstream political parties in the US that go this way. So for example, which example should I use? Well, I don't know. So when Bill Clinton was president of the United States, he famously said, "The era of big government is over." Wasn't true. The government kept growing. But there was a movement after Reagan and after Thatcher when parties on the left were doing this kind of brave rethinking. They were, as some of them described it, thinking the unthinkable. And some of the socialist parties, the Labour Party especially in England, was really trying to think, well, maybe we should take economic liberties more important, but more seriously. And they were trying to, Tony Blair, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, these are people from the left who were seeming to recognize the importance of economic liberty. A more striking example, a more recent example, and one that I'm especially interested in, is Sweden, especially under the finance minister, Anders Borg. Do some of you know who Anders Borg is? He's fascinating, and philosophically, he was involved in a scandal recently. Some of you know, maybe later on your own free time, You can Google Anders Borg and the scandal he was involved with. Well, it's amusing if it weren't so sad. But anyway, leaving the scandal aside, Anders Borg is a fabulous, I think, just amazing. He was the finance minister of Sweden. And Anders Borg was deep, he's a Swede, right? So he's deeply committed to the Swedish ideal of community and democracy, the Nordic model. But Anders Borg also realized, his view was that you should not judge the quality of Sweden's commitment to its fellow citizens by the size of the welfare programs that the state administers. Rather, he says, you should view welfare programs from a Swedish perspective as a kind of admission of failure. Because if the government needs to be doing these things for people, that means the government has failed to provide the real opportunities for people to stand on their own 2 feet. So his idea was that he was reaching for that higher star. It wasn't just, let's have really great welfare programs. It was like, let's have welfare programs that get people off welfare as quickly as possible and have them become independent members of society. A lot of people say that, but what he emphasized was that was the ideal. The ideal society would be a society with a very, very small welfare state, tiny welfare state, because it should have such a highly functioning economy with all the talent out there. Now currently, I mean, if you go across the city, there's so many talented people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of extremely talented people living in poverty, living without education, not contributing to this social world. What if they could be brought in? What if there were a way, and this is back to Sweden, what if there was a way to have all the talent of society fully engaged in the economy, fully engaged in the social, cultural life, creative life of that community? And Anders Borg had this saying that was very famous. He was going around Europe saying it all the time. He said, in Sweden, we're trying to make work more comfortable than welfare. So check it out, right? This is from a guy with a ponytail, gold earring, Swede guy. Didn't have bare feet so far as I knew, but when you read the scandal anyway. He wanted to make work more comfortable than welfare. If a Republican politician in the United States campaigned on a platform to make work more comfortable than welfare, he would be called a right-wing fascist and would get no votes. He'd be destroyed by the left. Because in America, we lack that strong, secure sense of a commitment to social justice. We lack it because one party has refused to recognize the importance of social justice. The Republicans typically, and the Libertarians too. But in Sweden, they had that background sense of social justice, that firm commitment, and from that, it makes it possible for a politician to say something like that, something as right-wing sounding as that, but actually as liberating as that really is, if you're honest about it, to make work more comfortable than welfare should be the ambition of a progressive government. That's about as market democratic as I can imagine. I keep on giving lectures.
No, don't worry.
Yeah.
We are here to listen to you. Another?
Hi. Maybe one question to clarify the contribution you are trying to make, because it seems that these ideas of looking for a compromise between these two extremes, it's around for a few decades.
Sure.
Tony Blair with the third way, etc.
Yeah,
so maybe giving examples, as you did with like giving cash, on how your view, your perspective could shed light on public policies.
Right.
So we would better understand your contribution you're trying to make to this debate.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned compromise and the Tony Blair's third way. I think that's exactly right. I think what we, on the political realm, there have been many attempts at compromise. That is, where people pick up ideas from the other side, often because their side's ideas are not working or they become unpopular. So they mix and match from the other people's sides. What I work on is I work on the level of political philosophy and pointing out stars, setting out ideals. So I'm not an expert at all in public policy or in the history of public policy. And what I'm talking about by market democracy is not a compromise. It's in no sense a compromise between the left and the right. It's an attempt to better explain, give a better, fuller account, a more attractive account of what it would mean to be a society, to think of society as a community of individuals, of people truly committed to the importance of their own lives, and also being truly committed to the importance, recognizing the importance of their fellow citizens' lives. So I know it's an unsatisfying answer, but I'm trying to think what's the best kind of justice. And my main project in the book is to say that, to put that as a moral ideal that can take on all challengers. Because in the end of the day, the moral arguments are extremely important over time. If we have and this is the Marxists found this for a long time, they had a moral punch in their arsenal that was enormously powerful. No matter how messed up their economic theory increasingly became to look increasingly antique and bizarre, they had this moral punch that allowed them to do unbelievable things in terms of drawing people towards that star, I think, unfortunately. Unfortunately, I won't even say I think. I won't even qualify it by saying I think. Horribly, unfortunately. But there's power in those stars, and that's what I'm aiming at. But again, I could mention other things, just that other features of the view. They're basically features that try to empower individuals to run their own lives the way they want to, and that means avoiding top-down, one-size-fits-all blunt instruments. It means constantly trying to think of ways to make society more polycentric, to delegate power to in a more level way across society, so many more individuals and nodes can be power centers and social changers. So it's an ideal that I think social democracy is an ideal which tries to level down hierarchies of all different sorts. It requires, I think, that we modify and be ready to criticize capitalism in lots of ways. But I think capitalist markets are often rigged by insiders. They rig the game to keep the insiders up and keep the outsiders out. And I think a truly free market is something more like a freed market. And just a constant danger of this idea of market democracy is that if you have markets in a society and you have democracy in a society, which is the ingredients for market democracy, there's a constant danger of them corrupting each other on contact. People always talk about on the left, people talk about how markets and money corrupts politics, but certainly it's true that politics corrupts markets on the other side, that these two mechanisms, these two ideals are in an uneasy relationship with each other all the time. Crony capitalism is not a truly free market. So it also means cleaning up markets, making them less corrupt than they are everywhere in the world.
Tenemos tiempo para minutos más, para algunas preguntas.
If you think more historically, you could say probably that John Stuart Mill was the first one to try to build the bridge, because he was much more in favor of liberty and absence of interference in the classical liberal tradition, but at the same time he was very critical of property, as
Yes.
he said, well, property, you have to qualify in that sense. Economic liberty for him were not so sacred.
That's right. That's right.
And at the same time, he did all these arguments separating production and distribution,
Yes.
which is to some extent the same argument they're trying to do.
Yes. Yes.
So, but he wasn't really successful.
No.
Why is that? So, because I try to understand, because your theory is very appealing.
Yes.
There's something in the theory that doesn't adapt
Yes.
for both classical liberals and also for social democrats. Why is that?
So just on Mill very briefly. Mill was my hero growing up. But I can't stand Mill now. I think he's the one who, God. So Mill, as you very politely put it, Mill was the one who traditionally, liberals thought that economic activities were among the most important domains of human freedom. They thought that these kinds of things we do when we work and we save and we choose are among the most important parts of freedom. But Mill was the greatest defender of the idea of liberty, just as a pure theoretical matter perhaps, maybe Kant, but maybe the greatest. Mill was the one who said, yeah, but you know what? Not in the economic realm. Mill said, the stuff, we need money, we need wealth, so that we can become free to become the individual, creative, in his view, philosophers that we should all be. So Mill started this great schism within liberal thinking. And once that crack started with Mill, other liberals started saying, you know what? Yeah, maybe Mill is right that we should protect people's freedoms, but not in the economic realm. They don't become who they are, the individual. They don't individuate themselves by the way they work or the way they. That's just kind of the grungy stuff that the poor people do or the working class does. The elites, elites like John Stuart Mill himself. That's the material stuff. Is just it's just the material fuel you need to launch yourself towards individuality. And other people pick that up. From reading the book, people like John Maynard Keynes. There's a beautiful short essay. It's so appalling, but you should really read it. It's this wonderful, beautifully written essay by John Maynard Keynes called "Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren." Have any of you read that? Have you read it? It's so revealing of this mindset. And the brief version is he's writing in 1930. Things are pretty bad economically, but he says, "Hey, don't worry about it. Within 100 years, by the time his grandkids are around, our societies have going to grown the economy is going to grow by about 10 times. And at that point, he says, the economic problem will have been solved. And once the economic problem has been solved, all that striving, for thousands of years, humans have had to work. They've had to compete with each other. They've had to try to strive to get more stuff. But once the economic problem is solved, that is by the time his grandkids are around, right about now, he would have thought, now we can finally turn our attention away from those bourgeois virtues of saving and scrimping, planning for the future, denying ourselves now and hopefully getting things later on, and we can instead turn ourselves to the important business of living decent lives. So this is a person within the liberal tradition, and he cites John Stuart Mill as his inspiration in this way. And John Rawls, the guy I mentioned, recently, the guy who wrote 1971, Rawls channels John Maynard Keynes. He channels John Stuart Mill on exactly that same line. So when John Rawls makes the list of basic rights and liberties that any free society, any democratic society should protect, economic liberties don't even appear. They're off the list. So far from taking remember I had the box with the economic liberties crossed off in red? That's Rawls. And Rawls got that idea from John Maynard Keynes and before him from John Stuart Mill. Keynes, by the way, says that when the day of abundance dawns, he seemed to think that we'd reach a certain point where the economic problem would be solved and it would be done. I mean, before we had the iPhone? I'm not sure what, before we had cars, right? At some point he thought we'd have enough and we could stop. And he said at that point, if people kept on working and they kept on innovating and kept on starting businesses and so on, that those bourgeois virtues would actually be revealed for the morbid neuroses that they'd always been. And people who kept on striving and working and saving should be consigned to mental institutions. He actually says this. And if you look online, which I hope you will to read that essay is like 20 pages long, and it's beautifully written, although it's, I think horrifyingly perverse in its content. Some of the versions, there's a footnote that's been scrubbed out. But if you look at a couple different versions, you'll see a footnote that was in the original. And in this footnote, he says, there's one group that when the day of abundance arises may prove especially problematic. They're the Jews. Because the Jews are so industrious, and so economically industrious, that it may take something stronger than a mental institution. It might take something like Christian conversion to Christianity. I don't know. I just mention that because people in college tend to think that John Maynard Keynes is a good guy. I take my cheap shots when I get my chances. I'm not above it. But anyway, but the important point is that, yeah, John Stuart Mill, he got something incredibly important wrong. And I think that's been a big crack in the whole liberal tradition since then. Liberals were attacked from the outside by socialists, but the internal attack, the movement of the transition of liberalism from a small state doctrine to a big state doctrine happened because of John Stuart Mill. It happened because of that argument of his that started all this other chains of argument. It's happened because John Stuart Mill said, the domain of economic liberty is not the domain of freedom. And once you lose that, there's no more reason to push back against the state, at least not on grounds of liberty. And then the whole story is the story we've lived since then in most countries.
John.
We have time for what, 2 more questions?
Hi.
Over here.
Hi.
When I was hearing what you were saying about free market fairness, I remembered I was living in Brazil in 2001, and there was a lot of, that was when Lula da Silva was elected for the first time. And at that point, Brazil was pretty scared with Lula da Silva, which was from the Workers' Party.
Yes.
But when he came into office and he started implementing some of these policies, and started using the economy as the fuel for social justice, and giving the poor people in the north of Brazil credit cards to buy food in supermarkets, especially for them. This is more or less what you're describing here. But then we know what happened to Lula da Silva after in the second term, right?
Right.
And so my question is, what other factors do you think are needed in this puzzle? Because this could derive rapidly into populism in many cases, right?
Yes.
So what other factors do you think should be included also in this formula, such as public order, solid institutions, clear separation of powers? I would, like to hear. What do you think about that?
Yeah. You're not going to be very satisfied with my answer. I don't think. Because I'm going to approach it on an abstract level, but it connects most of all. I'm going to project it at you all, because it's kind of a challenge for you, I think, more than a challenge for me. And as I said before, if a society is divided in a way that, as I see, Chile is divided, then the real power comes in attitudes that ordinary people have, whether people want change, whether people want to change their society and make it a better society than it is. So, for example, it would require, as I was saying before, to have something like a Chilean version of market democracy. You would develop your own conception of it if you found the general strategy appealing. It would take a commitment on the part of people who are currently partisans of one side, entrenched partisans of one side, and it would take courage on the part of people who are entrenched partisans of the other side. We all like to wear our team shirt. We're very tribal people. We're very tribal creatures. It's hard to take the shirt off and to try to think seriously about what the other side's insights are. It's much easier, it's much more comfortable, it's much more convenient, it's much more compatible with living a popular life on a college campus to kind of go along. Put the right stickers on your computer, wear have the Che Guevara poster or the Milton Friedman poster. I don't know about that. In your ring.
Someone does that?
I'm not sure who. Sergio Di Castro poster. Whoever you have in your rooms. It's easy to go along that way. But what's hard is to be serious. What's hard is to be serious about thinking independently about ways of moving on to to inventing new ways of thinking, to inventing new ideals. And I would just really emphasize that, I think the power of ideals, especially as they're formed in the minds of people like you, people in elite positions with special advantages, the power of your ideals that you have in your mind and your unwillingness, perhaps, hopefully, to accept the inherited ideologies as handed down to you, but your insistence on trying to do something better something new, something for yourselves. That's where the power comes from. So it didn't answer your question, but I think the challenge is essentially a challenge. The challenge of a society like Chile becoming better is a challenge to each one of you. It's a challenge to each one of you to decide how serious you are about the ideas, how willing you are to reach across the aisle, how willing you are to, think unpopular and unpleasant thoughts, uncomfortable thoughts even, thoughts that are even uncomfortable to you. It's not easy to do that, but it has a certain attraction, I hope.
So let's have the last one. Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más. Ignacio.
You mentioned Sweden.
Yeah. Sweden's become my hero for some weird reason.
Yes, you mentioned Sweden as an example of market democracy in a sense. And I remember a couple of years ago we had the visit of Luigi Zingales.
Yeah.
Probably you know, he's an economist from University of Chicago.
I know.
And he's in the same line, I would say, than your proposal. And I remember that in an interview I made to him, I asked him to give us an example of the kind of societies he was looking for. And as he mentioned Sweden.
Yeah.
And he had, even if probably the size of its states is too big for me, okay? Nevertheless,
I'm sorry, say again?
the size of the budget, the size
Yeah.
of the government was
Yeah.
too big for him.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, they fulfill all the meritocratic goals and free markets and competition and so on. So my question here is, don't you think that from time to time our discussion is too much contaminated by the discussion on the size of the state rather than the kind of state we should have in order to make the social justice you are proposing? Or in other words, which part of the equation is more important to discuss about the size of the state, which certainly go against some kind of our economic liberties, but probably more important than that is the way the government make redistribution. So what's your think on that?
I think that's a great point. Let me say something else about Sweden first, and then I'll come back to that point. It's very strange, I'm not sure if you can tell from the way I've been presenting this today, but can you guess what my own ideological leanings are? Like deep ones are? Left or right? How many think right? How many think left? Really? Wow. So I'm from a hardcore free market individualist. At your age, well, not quite, you're a little younger than you, Randian. Do you mind? My translator has been generously coming around with me the last couple of days as a Randian. He confessed to me after my first talk that every time he heard me say the word social justice, he cringed. So yesterday I gave 3 talks, and I tried to weave in the word social justice as often as possible so I could look back at the booth and watch him go like this. So, but my own background, sorry, I'll get to Sweden in a minute. My own background is really free market. I was a hardcore Hayekian for many years and kind of moved this way. But what really strikes me is that so many people in my erstwhile right-wing hardcore libertarian camp love Sweden. So Deirdre McCloskey is a good friend, and she was the first person who I looked up to as one of my sort of mentors, who said to me, John, you really need to go to Sweden because they're doing some really great stuff there. I said, Sweden? They're a bunch of socialists, they're a bunch of communists. I don't want, never mind the ponytail, like I said before, the ponytail. It's not my, it's not my thing. It's too ultra lefty. And Luigi is the same way. I was talking with him at a Mont Pelerin Society meeting recently. He was like, oh, Sweden, Sweden. Like, really? What's this? But one thing about Sweden that is an example about Sweden's experience that I just want to share with you because I think it's so interesting. When I went there a couple of years ago to talk about free market fairness, I was really surprised at how interested people there were. I mean, you guys are making me do 3 talks a day, which is more than most countries have any interest in me talking about these things. Sweden was just the same. In Sweden, it was like, I got there to do 1 talk, and like within the week, which I had planned to sort of spend touring around the country because I'd never been there before, they like loaded my, they loaded every single, and the reason why someone said to me was that Sweden had been a socialist ideal, right? It had been that left constellation. That was the moral constellation that Sweden steered itself by. And in fact, as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, that was still the only moral constellation. So the way Swedes thought of themselves was that they knew what justice required. They knew where the star was. They correctly in the 70s, they correctly identified the far left social justice, anti-economic liberty star as the correct star, but it was failing. It was failing for practical economic reasons. And so people said to me, at audience after audience, they said, Sweden liberalized, started becoming more market-oriented, looking down the barrel of an economic gun. So the heads of state turned the ship away from the constellation of justice towards the constellation of economic liberty, not because that was the moral ideal that they'd suddenly discovered, but because there was an economic gun aiming directly at their heads, so they had to go that way. And they would say things like, but as soon as we get the ship organized again economically, we're going to head back the other direction. And what free market fairness does is, it says that, you know what, maybe that's wrong. Maybe the failings of socialist Sweden were not only economic, though they were failing economically, they were also morally failing. And as Swedes started adopting more freedoms of education, for example, and other freedoms too, their labor market is still regrettably unfree, but when they started adopting other freedoms too, when they liberalized, they found that people seemed to be enjoying their lives better. They seemed to be relishing the chance to make, individuals were relishing the chance to make decisions about the composition of their lives for themselves. So again, I missed the main part of your question. Oh, sorry, but yeah, sorry.
Balance between size and...
Yeah, sorry. So I used your question to tell a story. I admit it at least. Yeah, but I think the idea of, well, I'll just say this what I think. I think the size question actually does matter. Not a joke. That's the Anders Borg joke, by the way, but I think sometimes people say it's not the size of the government that matters, it's the way that it's designed. I think size is actually a really good measure of whether the society is being respectful or not. I think when a government gets large, say as a percentage of GDP, it's a good thermometer. It's a reliable thermometer as to whether we're moving away from justice or moving towards justice. And I think as the size of the GDP share of government gets bigger and bigger, it's an almost sure sign we're moving away from justice. I know that's kind of a complicated issue, but that's what I think. I think intelligent design matters a lot, but the watchword, the thing that I would encourage you to keep in mind, the measuring stick I think that's most important when you evaluate government programs is, do they there are two parts. First, are they aimed at improving the lives of the least advantaged members of society? Not equality. Remember, that's not what we care about. The least advantaged members of society is what we should care about. And then two, are they designed in such a way that they respect people's freedom? Or are they a top-down, generalized approach for all? Or do they give the opportunities for people to experiment, especially the poorest people, and live lives that are more true to their own values? That would be the test of a really well-designed social policy, whether it's large or small, I think.
You have a number? I asked McCloskey one time what the ideal size of government would be, and she said 10% max.
Nice.
10% of GDP. Do you have a sort of a threshold or number or something, or?
I have a policy of never disagreeing with Deirdre McCloskey about anything. 10%, max.
And with that note, that makes me very happy. I think Hayek would agree. So, démosle un fuerte aplauso a nuestro invitado.
Thank you.